For decades, Australia was the envy of the developed world. It was the lucky country that never had a recession. From 1991 to 2020, nearly 3 decades of uninterrupted growth, Australia rode wave after wave of prosperity. Mining booms filled government coffers with cash. Real estate values climbed year after year. Wages were among the highest on earth, and the Australian dream, a backyard, a barbecue, and a beach within reach, seemed accessible to anyone willing to work for it. Sydney's harbour sparkled like a promise. Melbourne's laneways buzzed with confidence. The country ranked at the top of every quality of life index, and the world looked on with envy. But today, that dream is crumbling. Real wages have been falling for years. Housing has become so expensive that an entire generation has been locked out. The cost of groceries, energy, and rent has spiraled beyond what incomes can support. And here's the most disturbing part. GDP per capita, the measure of economic output per person, has been declining. That means Australians are not just feeling poorer. They are actually getting poorer, year after year. So what happened? How did a country blessed with natural resources, stable institutions, and decades of growth end up on a path toward decline? Today, we are exploring why Australia is becoming poorer every year, and whether there is any way to reverse the slide before an entire generation is left behind. Australia's modern prosperity story begins in the 1980s and the 1990s with a series of bold economic reforms. The government floated the currency, deregulated financial markets, cut tariffs, and opened the economy to competition. These were not popular moves at the time, but they worked. Australia transformed from a protected, inward-looking economy into a dynamic, globally integrated one. And then came the gift that kept on giving: the mining boom. Starting in the early 2000s, China's explosive industrialization created insatiable demand for iron ore, coal, natural gas, and other raw materials. Australia, sitting on some of the world's largest deposits, was perfectly positioned to supply them. Exports surged. In 2005, Australia exported around $106 billion worth of goods. By 2012, that figure had more than tripled to over $300 billion. Mining giants like BHP and Rio Tinto became some of the most profitable companies on the planet. Regional towns in Western Australia and Queensland boomed overnight. Workers with no university degrees were earning 6-figure salaries driving trucks in remote mines. The national budget swung into surplus. Unemployment dropped below 5%. But it was not just mining. Australia also perfected another growth engine: immigration-driven population expansion. Every year, hundreds of thousands of skilled migrants arrived, bringing capital, labor, and demand. From 2000 to 2020, Australia's population grew from 19 million to over 25 million. That was a 30% increase in just 2 decades. More people meant more housing demand, more consumption, more infrastructure projects. The economy grew not just because productivity was rising, but because there were simply more people buying, building, and working. And then there was property. Australians became obsessed with real estate. Prices rose steadily for decades, creating enormous paper wealth. Homeowners felt richer every year, even if their actual income had not changed. This wealth effect encouraged spending and borrowing. Banks lent aggressively, and the property market became the centerpiece of Australia's economic identity. By 2017, household wealth had reached a staggering $9.5 trillion, nearly 5 times the country's gross domestic product. It seemed like nothing could go wrong. Australia's reputation soared. The country went 27 consecutive years without a technical recession, a record unmatched anywhere in the developed world. It weathered the 2008 global financial crisis with barely a scratch, thanks to aggressive government stimulus and China's continued hunger for commodities. The International Monetary Fund called it the miracle economy. Life was good. Wages were high, jobs were plentiful, the future looked secure. But that confidence, that belief that Australia's prosperity was built on solid ground rather than good luck, would soon prove to be dangerously misplaced. The first cracks appeared quietly in 2012. China's growth began to slow. The infrastructure megaprojects that had consumed Australian iron ore and coal started to mature. Commodity prices, which had soared to record highs, began a steady descent. Iron ore, which had peaked above $180 per ton in 2011, fell below $40 per ton by 2015. Coal prices collapsed. Natural gas exports, while still strong, could not compensate for the broader downturn. The mining boom, the golden goose that had powered Australia's economy for a decade, was ending. But Australia's policymakers made a fateful choice. Instead of using the boom years to diversify the economy, invest in innovation, and build new industries, they doubled down on the old model. The solution to slowing mining revenues was simple pump up the property market even more, and keep immigration high to drive population growth. Interest rates were slashed. From 2011 to 2016, the Reserve Bank of Australia cut rates from 4.75% to just 1.5%. Cheap credit flooded into housing. Prices, already elevated, went parabolic and household debt climbed. Then came COVID-19, and the response turbocharged an already dangerous situation. Borders closed, immigration stopped. But rather than allowing the overheated property market to cool, the government and the central bank intervened aggressively. Interest rates were cut to a record low of 0.1%. Massive fiscal stimulus, over $300 billion, was injected into the economy. Loan payment holidays were granted. First home buyer grants were expanded. The result? House prices did not just recover, they exploded. From 2020 to 2022, Australian property prices rose by over 28% nationally. In some cities, like Sydney and Melbourne, median house prices crossed $1.3 million. The problem was that wages did not rise at anything close to that rate. In fact, after adjusting for inflation, wages barely moved. So while homeowners felt wealthier on paper, renters and young families saw the dream of ownership drift further away. And when inflation finally arrived in 2022, driven by global supply shocks and domestic demand, the Reserve Bank had no choice but to reverse course. Interest rates soared from 0.1% to over 4.35% in less than 2 years, the fastest hiking cycle in Australian history. Households that had borrowed heavily at ultra-low rates were suddenly crushed. Mortgage repayments doubled for many. Consumer spending, which had been propped up by cheap debt and rising house prices, collapsed. Businesses struggled. Unemployment began creeping up. For the first time in a generation, Australians started to realize that their wealth had been an illusion, built on borrowed money and inflated assets rather than genuine productivity. To keep the economy afloat during the mining downturn, Australia chose the easy path. But that path led straight into a debt trap. And now, the bill is coming due. Australia does not just have a housing problem. It has a housing crisis so severe it is systematically impoverishing an entire generation. The median house price in Sydney is now 13.8 times the median household income. In Melbourne, it is 11.2 times. To understand how extreme that is, the OECD considers anything above 3 times income to be unaffordable. Australia's major cities are now 4 to 5 times beyond that threshold, making them among the most expensive housing markets on earth, competing with Hong Kong and Vancouver. The numbers are staggering. A typical Sydney household earning $120,000 a year would need to save for over 11 years just to afford a 20% deposit on a median price home, assuming they could save 20% of their pre-tax income. For renters, the situation is equally dire. Rental yields have collapsed, but absolute rents have skyrocketed. In 2023, the median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Sydney exceeded $650 per week. That is over $33,000 per year, consuming more than 40% of median household income before taxes. How did this happen? After the mining boom faded, Australia's economy became addicted to property. From 2012 onward, residential construction, real estate services, and property-related lending became the primary drivers of gross domestic product growth. By 2022, the real estate sector directly accounted for nearly 13% of gross domestic product. Add construction, home renovations, and property services, and the figure approaches 20%. That is $1 in every 5 tied to buying, selling, building, or maintaining houses. Not manufacturing, not technology, not exports. Houses. When housing becomes this central to an economy, it creates a vicious cycle. Existing homeowners whose wealth is tied to property values resist any policy that might lower prices. Local councils block new developments, and state governments drag their feet on planning reform. Banks, holding trillions of dollars in mortgage debt, fear a price crash. Politicians, many of whom own multiple investment properties, avoid tough decisions. The result is chronic undersupply. Australia builds only about 170,000 new dwellings per year while needing closer to 240,000 to keep up with population growth and household formation. But here is where it gets truly dangerous. Australian household debt has reached 186% of disposable income, among the highest in the developed world. That means the average household owes nearly twice what they earn in a year, almost all of it in mortgage debt. When interest rates were 0.1%, this was manageable, but now, with rates above 4%, millions of households are struggling. Mortgage stress, defined as spending more than 30% of income on housing, now affects over 1.5 million Australian households. Many families are cutting back on food, skipping medical appointments, and pulling children out of extracurricular activities just to make their mortgage payments. And this is not just about individual hardship. When such a large share of household income goes to servicing debt and paying rent, there is less money for everything else. Consumer spending stagnates, small businesses suffer, innovation funding dries up, the entire economy slows. Young professionals, the very people who should be starting businesses, taking risks, and driving the next wave of growth, are instead trapped in a cycle of rent, debt, and survival. Australia is not just locking people out of homes, it is locking them out of economic mobility. The house has become a prison, and the key to escape is nowhere to be found. Behind Australia's falling living standards lies a quiet catastrophe. Productivity growth has collapsed. From 2013 to 2023, labor productivity, the measure of economic output per hour worked, grew by just 0.5% per year. Let that sink in, half a percentage point. That is the slowest productivity growth in over 60 years and far below the OECD average of 1.3%. This is not just a statistic. It is the reason Australians are getting poorer. Productivity is the engine of prosperity. When workers can produce more value per hour, businesses earn higher profits, wages can rise, and living standards improve without triggering inflation. But when productivity stalls, the economy becomes stuck. Wages cannot rise sustainably. Government revenues fall short. The only way to grow is to work more hours or add more workers, neither of which improves individual wealth. That is exactly what has happened in Australia. GDP has grown, but only because of population increases. GDP per capita, the measure that actually matters for living standards, has been declining since late 2022. Australians are working just as hard, but getting less for it. So why has productivity collapsed? One major factor is underinvestment in business capital and technology. From 2012 to 2022, business investment as a share of GDP fell from 13.5% to just 10.8%. Companies, especially small and medium enterprises, are not buying new equipment, upgrading software, or investing in automation. Why? Because capital is expensive and most available credit flows into property rather than productive assets. Banks would rather lend $2 million for a house than $200,000 for a factory upgrade. The result is Australian businesses are falling behind global competitors in efficiency and innovation. Another culprit is the composition of Australia's economy. Despite being a wealthy nation, Australia remains heavily dependent on low productivity sectors. Mining, while profitable, is capital intensive and does not employ many people. Meanwhile, the fastest growing employment sectors are hospitality, retail, healthcare, and aged care, all of which have inherently lower productivity growth. When workers shift from manufacturing or technology into serving coffee or providing elder care, national productivity naturally declines. It is not that those jobs are not valuable. They are, but they do not generate the output per hour that drives economic growth. Then there is the education and skills mismatch. Australia produces plenty of university graduates, but there is a growing disconnect between what people study and what the economy needs. Engineering and IT graduates often struggle to find work in their fields and end up in roles that do not use their skills. At the same time, critical trades like electricians, plumbers, and builders face severe shortages, forcing businesses to delay projects or pay premium wages. The skills shortage is so acute that companies report it as their #1 constraint on growth. But perhaps the most fundamental issue is culture. Australia's business culture has become risk-averse and short-term focused. The country produces fewer startups per capita than comparable nations. Venture capital investment is anemic. Research and development spending is just 1.8% of gross domestic product, well below the OECD average of 2.7%. The most talented graduates often go into property development, finance, or move overseas rather than starting innovative companies. When a society's brightest minds are focused on buying and selling houses rather than building the future, productivity inevitably suffers. The consequences compound over time. Low productivity means low wage growth. Over the past decade, real wage growth has averaged just 0.3% per year after inflation. Compare that to the 1990s and the early 2000s, when real wages grew by 1.5% to 2% annually. For a worker earning $70,000, that difference means their purchasing power has barely changed in 10 years. while housing and living costs have soared. This is not about working harder. Australians already work long hours. It is about working smarter, and on that measure, the country is falling behind. Without a productivity renaissance, Australia cannot escape the trap. The economy cannot grow fast enough to service its debts, fund its aging population, or raise living standards. It is stuck in neutral while the rest of the world accelerates. Australia's economy rests on a foundation that could crack at any moment, an over-reliance on China. In 2023, China accounted for 38% of all Australian exports, worth approximately $180 billion. No other developed nation is as economically dependent on a single trading partner, especially one with which it has increasingly strained political relations. This is not just a trade relationship, it is an economic vulnerability that threatens the country's prosperity. The numbers tell a stark story. Iron ore alone accounts for about $120 billion in annual export revenue, and 80% of it goes to China. Australia supplies roughly 60% of China's total iron ore imports. When China sneezes, Western Australia catches pneumonia. In 2015, when Chinese steel demand softened and iron ore prices crashed, the Australian dollar plummeted, government revenues collapsed, and mining towns faced mass layoffs. That was just a taste. A sustained slowdown in Chinese construction or a deliberate shift away from Australian suppliers could wipe out the country's largest revenue stream almost overnight. And China has already shown it is willing to use trade as a weapon. From 2020 to 2022, following Australia's calls for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19 and its pushback on Chinese influence operations, Beijing imposed punitive tariffs and informal bans on Australian wine, barley, coal, lobster, beef, and timber. At its peak, these restrictions affected over $20 billion in annual exports. While iron ore remained untouched, largely because China had no ready alternative, the message was clear: economic coercion is on the table. But here is what makes this dependency even more dangerous. Australia has not diversified. Decades of warnings from economists, strategic planners, and business leaders have been ignored. The country still exports mostly raw commodities with minimal processing. Iron ore is dug up and shipped straight to China. Coal leaves Australian ports unrefined. Natural gas is liquefied and sent offshore. The value-added processing, the manufacturing, the advanced fabrication that creates high-wage jobs and resilience happens elsewhere. Compare Australia's export complexity to other resource-rich nations. Norway exports oil and gas, but also built world-leading industries in renewable energy technology, aquaculture, and maritime engineering. Canada has natural resources, but also strong aerospace, pharmaceutical, and technology sectors. Australia has mining, agriculture, and tourism. When you look at the Economic Complexity Index, which measures the sophistication and diversity of exports, Australia ranks 87th globally, behind countries like Thailand, Serbia, and Egypt. That is a damning indictment for one of the world's wealthiest nations. The consequences of this narrow base are already visible. When commodity prices are high, Australia feels rich. Tax revenues surge. The budget looks healthy. Confidence rises. But when prices fall or demand shifts, the entire economy lurches. There is no cushion, no alternative industries to pick up the slack. Manufacturing, which once employed over 1 million Australians, has shrunk to barely 800,000 jobs. The auto industry is gone. Electronics manufacturing is gone. Shipbuilding is a shadow of its former self. Advanced manufacturing accounts for less than 6% of GDP, one of the lowest shares in the OECD. And the risk isn't just economic. Geopolitically, Australia is aligned with the United States through defense pacts and intelligence sharing while being economically bound to China. That's a precarious balancing act. As tensions between Washington and Beijing escalate, Australia is forced to choose sides on issues like Taiwan, the South China Sea, and technology restrictions. Each choice carries the risk of economic retaliation from China or security consequences from the United States. It's a no-win scenario born from decades of taking the easy path, selling dirt instead of building industries. Australia hitched its wagon to China's growth without building any alternatives. Now it's trapped in a dependency that grows more dangerous every year, and the longer the country waits to diversify, the more painful that transition becomes. Australians are facing a cost of living crisis that is systematically stripping away their prosperity. Grocery prices have surged by over 8% annually for the past 3 years, far outpacing wage growth. Energy bills have skyrocketed, with electricity prices up 25% and gas up 20% since 2022. Petrol regularly exceeds $2 per liter in major cities. Health insurance premiums rise 5 to 6% every year, like clockwork. And while all of this is happening, real wages, adjusted for inflation, have fallen for 7 consecutive quarters. Australians are not imagining it, they really are getting poorer. The supermarket duopoly of Woolworths and Coles controls nearly 70% of Australia's grocery market, giving them enormous pricing power. When input costs rise, they pass them through immediately, but when input costs fall, retail prices stay elevated. An investigation by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission found that retail margins have widened significantly, suggesting companies are using inflation as cover to boost profits. Australians are paying more not just because of global inflation, but because of domestic market concentration. Energy tells a similar story. Australia is one of the world's largest exporters of natural gas, yet Australian households pay among the highest energy prices in the developed world. Why? Because domestic gas reservation policies are weak or non-existent in most states. Gas that could power Australian homes and businesses is instead exported overseas under long-term contracts signed decades ago. When global energy prices spiked in 2022, Australian prices followed, even though the country produces far more energy than it consumes. It is the absurd reality of being an energy-rich nation with energy-poor citizens. Then there is childcare. For families with young children, childcare costs consume 25 to 30% of household income, among the highest rates in the OECD. Many mothers, particularly in middle-income households, find it financially irrational to work full-time because after-tax earnings barely cover childcare costs. This forces families into a trap: sacrifice career progression and stay home, or work full-time and essentially hand one parent's entire salary to childcare providers. Medical costs are climbing faster than general inflation. Even with Medicare, out-of-pocket healthcare expenses have risen sharply. Specialist consultations, dental work, mental health services, and pharmaceuticals all carry substantial costs. For a family with chronic health needs, medical expenses can run $5,000 to $10,000 per year, money that used to go towards savings or quality of life improvements. But here is what makes this crisis so insidious. It is compounding with the housing trap. A typical family in Sydney or Melbourne now faces this brutal math: $650 per week in rent, or $4,500 per month in mortgage payments. Add $400 per week for groceries, $100 per week for energy and utilities, $300 per week for transport, $250 per week for childcare if they have young kids. That is over $8,000 per month in essential expenses before any discretionary spending. The median household income after tax is roughly $7,500 per month. There is simply no room left for savings, emergencies, or building wealth. The psychological toll is devastating. Surveys show that over 60% of Australians report financial stress. 1 in 3 say they have skipped meals to save money. Food bank usage has surged by 40% since 2020. These are not the statistics of a prosperous developed nation. These are the warning signs of a society under strain. When basic survival consumes all available income, people stop taking risks. They stop starting businesses, they stop having children, they stop investing in education or skills. The economy stagnates not because people are lazy, but because they are exhausted. Australia's cost of living crisis is not just making people poorer in the short term. It is destroying the foundation for future prosperity. In 2023, Australia experienced a net outflow of skilled workers for the first time in decades. Over 70,000 Australian citizens left the country permanently, the highest number since records began. These are not retirees or students on gap years. They are skilled engineers, doctors, IT professionals, teachers, and tradespeople, the very people the economy needs most. And they are leaving for one simple reason: they can build better lives elsewhere. The pay gap is brutal. A software engineer in Sydney earning $120,000 can make $200,000 in Silicon Valley, or $150,000 in London, in markets with lower housing costs relative to income. A doctor in Melbourne earning $180,000 can earn $300,000 in the United Arab Emirates with no income tax. A tradie earning $80,000 in Brisbane can make $120,000 in Canada with a clear path to affordable home ownership. When you can double your income and have your housing costs by moving, the math becomes undeniable. But it is not just about money. It is about opportunity and quality of life. Young professionals see a country where wages have stagnated, where housing is permanently out of reach, where career progression is slow and innovation is scarce. They see friends and colleagues grinding away for decades just to afford a basic home in the suburbs, sacrificing travel, children, and life experiences to service a mortgage. And they are asking, why? The most damaging losses are in critical shortage areas. Australia faces severe shortages of general practitioners, nurses, teachers, and engineers, yet these professionals are leaving faster than they can be replaced. Rural and regional areas are hit hardest. When a town loses its only doctor or its experienced teachers, the social fabric begins to unravel. Schools struggle, health services degrade, young families move away, the town begins to die, and Australia's immigration system cannot compensate. Hundreds of thousands of migrants still arrive each year, but there is a skills mismatch. Many new arrivals lack the specific qualifications or experience that departing professionals possessed. Foreign credentials are often not recognized, forcing skilled migrants into lower-level work. The nurse from India ends up as a healthcare assistant. The engineer from Pakistan drives an Uber. They are contributing, but not at the level the economy needs. Meanwhile, Australian universities, once world-class talent pipelines, are hemorrhaging their best graduates. Engineering and computer science graduates increasingly look overseas immediately after finishing their degrees. Why stay in a country where entry-level salaries are $70,000 when global tech firms offer $150,000 plus packages in other markets? The country spends billions educating top talent, only to watch them leave and contribute to other economies. It is a systematic wealth transfer in reverse. The feedback loop is vicious. As skilled workers leave, the companies that could offer competitive opportunities struggle to find talent. Projects get delayed, innovation slows, productivity suffers, wages remain suppressed, which makes more people want to leave, and the cycle continues. Australia is not just losing workers, it is losing the future. When your best and brightest conclude that their own country cannot provide opportunity, that is not a brain drain. It is a verdict. So can Australia turn this around? Or is the country locked into a slow, grinding decline? The honest answer is uncomfortable. Structural change is possible, but deeply unlikely given current political incentives and social attitudes. The problems are clear. Property values must moderate to restore affordability, but any government that deliberately crashes house prices faces political suicide. 2/3 of Australian households own their homes, and their voting power protects the status quo. Productivity must rise, but that requires creative destruction, business failures, and industry transformation that is painful in the short term. China dependency must be reduced through economic diversification, but building new industries takes decades and requires investment that could have been made years ago. These are not distant threats looming on the horizon. They are today's reality. Real wages are falling now, housing is unaffordable now, skilled workers are leaving now, GDP per capita is declining now. Every year of inaction makes the eventual adjustment more painful and the loss of prosperity more permanent. Yet, Australia's political system seems paralyzed, locked in a cycle of short-term thinking, where each government kicks the can down the road, hoping the crisis explodes on someone else's watch. But there is something deeply resilient about Australian society that should not be dismissed. Communities are adapting in their own ways. Co-housing arrangements are emerging. Intergenerational living is increasing. Locals are building grassroots innovation hubs and supporting each other through shared economies. Technology workers are forming remote-first companies that compete globally while living in regional Australia with lower costs. These are not signs of a prosperous boom, but they demonstrate the slow art of adaptation, the stubborn refusal to surrender even as the system fails. Perhaps what is happening to Australia is a preview of what awaits much of the developed world. Aging populations, asset price bubbles, productivity slowdowns, geopolitical dependencies. These are not uniquely Australian problems. They are the structural challenges of mature economies that chose comfort over innovation and short-term wealth over long-term strength. Australia's struggle is not just Australia's story anymore. It is a warning written in falling wages and locked-out generations. The question is not whether Australia will recover the prosperity of the mining boom years. It almost certainly will not. The question is whether it can find a new model, one not built on digging up dirt and inflating house prices, but on genuine innovation, productivity, and shared opportunity. Because every wealthy nation eventually faces a choice: adapt and reinvent, or manage a graceful decline. Right now, Australia is choosing neither. It is simply hoping the problem resolves itself. And hope, as any economist will tell you, is not a strategy. Perhaps that is the most Australian response of all, the faith that she will be right, mate, even as the numbers say otherwise.